My name is Margaret Thompson, though most people just call me Maggie. And for most of my adult life, I thought I had the kind of marriage people wrote about in novels. The kind where love isn't just fireworks in the beginning, but the steady, warm light that carries you through the storms of everyday life. And for a long time, that's exactly what Daniel, my husband, gave me. I met him in my 20s when I was working as a librarian in a small suburban town not far from where I grew up. And Daniel was this tall, soft-spoken man with a smile that could calm any room. And despite his family's wealth and status, something I honestly didn't even know the full extent of until later, he carried himself without arrogance, more interested in people's stories than in flashing money or connections. He courted me in the sweetest, most old-fashioned way, bringing me coffee on my breaks, leaving little notes tucked inside the library books I recommended to him. And within 2 years, we were married, building a home together that, while modest compared to the sprawling estate his parents lived on, felt like a castle to me because it was ours, filled with laughter, late-night talks, and plans for the future. But even from the very beginning, there was a shadow over our happiness: his family. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, was the first to make me feel it. At our engagement dinner, she leaned across the table, her pearls gleaming under the restaurant lights, and said in a tone that managed to sound polite yet cruel, "Daniel always had a taste for simpler things." Her eyes scanning me up and down like I was some cheap trinket he'd picked up at a flea market. And while Daniel squeezed my hand under the table and whispered not to mind her, I knew in that moment that Eleanor had already decided I was not worthy of being a Thompson. Charles, his father, was quieter, always with this look in his eyes like he was calculating whether I'd cost the family too much, and his siblings, Rebecca and Stephen, didn't even bother hiding their disdain. Rebecca in particular seemed to relish making snide remarks, laughing with her friends about my budget dresses or how I probably thought chain restaurants were fine dining. And while Stephen was more charming on the surface, offering me fake smiles and asking about my job, I could see the way he exchanged knowing looks with his mother, as if I were some temporary inconvenience they'd have to tolerate until Daniel came to his senses. Still, Daniel loved me fiercely, defended me whenever the lines were crossed, and as long as he was by my side, I thought I could withstand their coldness, because love, I believed, was stronger than disapproval. And for years we managed, carving out a happy life separate from their world, though Daniel still visited them out of duty, dragging me along sometimes, which always ended in icy dinners where Eleanor would complain about how Daniel was wasting his potential and how Rebecca and Stephen were working so hard to keep the family name strong. Thinly veiled digs meant to highlight that Daniel had chosen love over ambition. I learned to nod politely, to keep my head down, to smile when necessary, but inside I always felt like a trespasser in their world. Then, 2 years ago, tragedy struck like a storm tearing through everything I had built my life around. Daniel fell ill, suddenly and devastatingly. It was a rare heart condition that we had no warning for, and within months, my strong, steady husband was gone, leaving me a widow at 45, standing in the middle of our home that suddenly felt cavernous without his laughter echoing in the halls. The grief was unbearable, a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of crying could relieve, and for weeks I moved through life in a fog, clinging to the routines we once shared, like making coffee for 2 in the morning before remembering there was no one to drink it with me, or reaching across the bed at night only to find his side cold. When the funeral came, I thought perhaps, despite our history, his family and I would be united in our mourning, but I should have known better. The church was filled with flowers and whispered condolences, and as I stood at the front greeting people, my heart breaking with every handshake, Eleanor swept in wearing black lace and diamonds, her face twisted into the kind of expression that wasn't grief but performance, as though she were the leading actress in a play called The Perfect Widow's Mother. She hugged me briefly, stiffly, then leaned close and whispered in my ear, "Don't think for a second that this changes anything. What belongs to the family will return to the family." I pulled back, stunned. Staring at her, she dabbed her eyes dramatically with a silk handkerchief and moved on to greet others, leaving me frozen in place with her words echoing in my mind. What belonged to the family? Did she mean Daniel's property, his accounts, our home? At the time, I was too broken to process it fully, but the coldness of it lodged in my chest like a shard of glass, and I knew deep down that whatever storm was coming hadn't even begun yet. I tried to shake off Eleanor's words, telling myself she must have meant something else, that maybe grief had twisted her tongue. But in the days that followed, her meaning became clearer and clearer, because almost immediately after Daniel was laid to rest, the Thompsons began circling me like vultures who had caught the scent of prey, their voices sickly sweet, but their eyes sharp with calculation. And I realized very quickly that whatever sympathy they had shown at the funeral had been nothing more than a facade. Rebecca called me first, her voice syrupy as she told me she just wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed, and then slid into a casual remark about how these things, wills, properties, accounts, can be very confusing for someone without experience. As if I was a child who couldn't possibly understand the basics of what my husband and I had built together. I thanked her politely, but my stomach churned because there was something in her tone that reminded me of Eleanor's words, a subtle claim of ownership over things that never had been hers. A few days later, Stephen came by unannounced, holding a casserole dish he probably didn't cook himself, wearing that easy grin that always made strangers believe he was the charming one in the family, but I saw past it. I always had. He sat at my kitchen table, looked around the house with an assessing eye, and told me he knew Daniel would have wanted us to look after you. Then slid a Monoleva envelope across the table, saying it contained some documents that would help keep everything in order. My hand shook as I opened it, pretending to glance through the neat pages filled with legal jargon, but even at first skim, I saw phrases that made my skin crawl. Words like transfer, signatory release, and family trust. And though I wasn't a lawyer, I wasn't stupid. They wanted me to sign things that didn't feel right. And yet, Stephen smiled like he was doing me a favor, tapping the table and saying, "No rush, Maggie, but the sooner we handle this, the smoother things will be for everyone." Everyone. Not me, not Daniel's wishes, but everyone else in the Thompson clan. That night, I sat in the living room staring at the documents, grief and suspicion tangling in my chest until I could barely breathe. Daniel had always told me that he wanted me secure, that if anything happened to him, I would be protected. And I knew he had updated his will just 2 years ago after his health scare, so why were they pressing me so hard, so quickly, to sign something new? My best friend Emily came over the next day, bringing coffee and that blunt honesty I had always loved her for, and when I showed her the papers, her face turned red with anger. "Maggie, do not sign a single thing," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through my haze of grief. "They're trying to take you for everything. I've seen this before. Families circling widows like sharks." Her words lit a spark in me, one that cut through the fog of sorrow, and I realized she was right, that I was not just imagining the coldness or the subtle threats, that Eleanor's cryptic words had been a warning of exactly what they planned to do. But even as anger rose in me, I forced myself to keep calm, to play the role they expected, the grieving, overwhelmed widow, because if they thought I was weak, they would get careless, and if they got careless, I could find out exactly what they were planning. And so when Rebecca came by with tea a few days later and casually suggested that I move out of the house because it must be so painful being surrounded by memories, I smiled faintly, nodded like I was considering it, and let her ramble on about how the family estate has so much room and it would be easier to keep everything under one roof. Easier for whom? Certainly not for me. Every visit, every phone call, every fake smile I endured, all the while keeping mental notes, saving copies of every document they tried to slip under my nose. And though my heart was still heavy with loss, a new emotion began to burn quietly beneath the grief: determination. I would not let them take what Daniel had worked for, what he had left for me. What he had told me in whispered late-night conversations was meant to keep me safe when he no longer could. What I didn't know then was just how far they were willing to go and how much darker their intentions really were. But I was about to find out. Because one evening as I was gathering laundry upstairs, I overheard a conversation in my own kitchen that chilled me to the bone. I froze at the top of the stairs, heart hammering, as Rebecca's voice floated up, dripping with that venomous satisfaction I had come to recognize all too well. And Stephen, ever the smooth talker, leaned in close, murmuring words I never wanted to hear about Daniel and what he, quote, would have wanted, as if they had the right to decide his wishes for me. And in that instant, I realized their plan was far more elaborate than I had imagined. They weren't just trying to trick me into signing some routine paperwork. They had orchestrated every interaction, every phone call, every concerned visit to make me feel confused, weak, and dependent, all while building the illusion that they were supporting me. And yet, as I listened, the more they revealed, the more my mind sharpened, calculating and planning, because I had Daniel's words, his love, and the legal protection of his will on my side. And I knew that if I played this right, I could turn their arrogance against them. For the next several days, I put on a mask of vulnerability, answering their calls with quivering voices, allowing Rebecca to drop hints about moving in together under the pretense of family unity, letting Stephen subtly question my memory and judgment, all the while secretly photographing documents, recording conversations when they left their phones carelessly on speaker, and sending Emily out to check financial records and confirm the exact details of Daniel's estate. Because every family had its secrets, but theirs would be laid bare if I waited patiently. Then came the day they invited me to the family estate under the guise of a meeting to finalize things for your comfort, and my stomach churned with the mix of fear and anticipation, because I knew this was the trap they had been setting, the stage where they expected me to crumble and sign away everything. And yet as I drove there with Emily in the passenger seat, whispering reassurances and carrying a folder thick with evidence and legal backup, I felt a strange exhilaration, the kind that comes when you know the moment of reckoning has finally arrived. As we pulled up to the estate, Eleanor greeted me at the door, her smile tight, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who believes they have already won. And Rebecca flitted behind her, murmuring sweetly about how Daniel would have wanted harmony, while Stephen lingered just out of sight, his hands folded, expression carefully neutral, all rehearsing the part they thought I would play. I walked in, shoulders straight, voice calm, heart pounding like war drums in my chest, and we were led into a room where a long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, surrounded by the Thompson clan, who all wore their masks of polite concern, and Eleanor began, in that voice I had learned to loathe, "Maggie, we just want to make sure everything is smooth for you. Daniel always wanted family unity, and this paperwork will ensure there are no complications." I nodded slowly, lifting the folder I had tucked under my arm as if it were nothing, and as I placed it on the table, Mr. Harrington, my lawyer, stepped into the room behind me, and the expressions that had been carefully rehearsed for weeks cracked in an instant, eyes widening, jaws dropping, because they expected only a trembling widow, not a woman armed with evidence and legal authority. I smiled faintly, the calmest I had felt in months, and began to speak, my voice steady, each word cutting through their carefully constructed facade like a scalpel, explaining that I had consulted with my attorney, that every document they had tried to present was illegal and would have nullified my rights, and that copies of conversations, emails, and hidden recordings in that folder proved their intent to manipulate me, deceive me, and seize what was never theirs to take. Eleanor's face went pale, lips trembling as she sputtered out denials. Rebecca gaped, clutching her wine glass like a lifeline, and Stephen's charming demeanor evaporated, replaced with a kind of desperation I had never thought I would see. Because in that room, the power had shifted irrevocably. I continued, voice rising just enough to assert authority, detailing every attempt they had made to coerce me, every subtle manipulation, every plan overheard in my own kitchen, and as I spoke, I saw the family who had once towered over me with their arrogance shrinking, realizing that their scheming had not only failed, but had been meticulously documented, their betrayal laid bare for all to see. And in that moment, I felt a rush of vindication mixed with sorrow because I wished they had never learned the lesson at the cost of Daniel's death. But the truth was stronger than grief, and I was stronger than their cruelty. Mr. Harrington then handed each of them copies of legal notices, making it clear that any further attempt to interfere with the estate would result in immediate legal action. And as the realization dawned on them, I looked around the room and saw everything that had seemed unshakable crumble, the control, the pretense, the cold smiles. And I finally allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in months, because the nightmare that had begun with Daniel's death, with Eleanor's chilling words at the funeral, and the weeks of manipulation by a family who claimed love but only sought power, was ending. And I was still here, whole, rightful, and victorious. Eleanor's face twisted in rage, muttering about injustice, but I didn't care because I had my life, my inheritance, my dignity. And as I walked out of that house, Emily beside me, I realized something profound. I was not the fragile widow they had thought I was. I was not powerless, and Daniel's faith in me had never been misplaced. For months afterwards, I received silence from the Thompsons. Their attempts to manipulate or contact me ceased entirely, and in that quiet, I rebuilt my life, restoring the house, turning grief into purpose. And even though the memory of their betrayal lingered, it no longer had power over me because I had survived, I had fought, and I had won. Not just the property, but the knowledge that love and truth, combined with patience and courage, could overcome even the most calculated cruelty. And so I live now with a quiet strength, a cautionary wisdom, and the memory of Daniel not as a shadow of grief, but as the foundation of resilience, knowing that even in the face of those who would take everything from you, you can reclaim your life with cleverness, courage, and an unwavering belief in what is rightfully yours.